Given the remarks made by Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan earlier this year, South African consumers can expect to pay tax on sugar and sweetened consumer products from early next year. The Minister of Health, Aaron Motsoaledi, has also added his voice and has been very forceful in discouraging the consumption of sugar because of its health effects and burden it places on the healthcare system. The consumption of sugar has been blamed for the high incidence of obesity and the rise in non-communicable diseases. The beverage companies are amongst those who are opposed to the imposition of such taxes, and they argue that the negative effects of sugar have not been conclusively proven. And we are joined to discuss the proposed sugar tax as well as the possible outcomes of its implementation by a professor at the University of Illinois and director of the UIC Health Policy Centre, Professor Frank Chaloupka. And he is with us here on the program. Prof, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And there's an event that was called Priceless in South Africa, hosted by Wits University, which says you can make a direct link with consumption of sugar, the high incidence of non-communicable diseases with the consumption of sugar. But the beverage companies argue against that, say it has not been conclusively proven.
No, I think it has been conclusively proven. There are many scientific studies that have shown the clear link between sugary beverage consumption and type 2 diabetes, which is something that's really on the rise in South Africa. I saw some statistics that showed that the obesity or the diabetes prevalence rate has gone up by 67% just in 5 years. There are also studies that show the link to cardiovascular disease, to cancers, to tooth decay. So there are a number of different diseases that are conclusively scientifically linked to the consumption of sugary beverages.
I suppose their argument is that, they've been selling the sugary beverages for a long, long time. Chocolate sweets have been promoted and then put near the checkout points in supermarkets, and there was no hullabaloo about this for years. And why all of a sudden the strident voices that are against sugar consumption?
Well, I think what's happened is that over time, sugar consumption has increased fairly significantly. So if you look at the data from South Africa, you could see the steady rise in sugar consumption, sugary beverage consumption in particular, over the last 15 years, and it's projected to continue to rise in the future. And part of what we see now is that the diseases that are caused by the changes in consumption take a little bit of time to show up. So now you're starting to see the rise in the non-communicable diseases that are caused by the consumption. So I think it's partly that sugar has been around for a long time, but it's been increasingly consumed in increasing quantities. It's showing up more and more in different processed foods. So consumption has gone up, and we're starting to see the consequences of it now.
Yes.
And because we're starting to see the consequences, not just in South Africa, but around the world, we're starting to see governments take action to try to do something to reduce consumption. And part of what we're looking at is fiscal measures. I'm an economist, so we have studied the effects of taxes and prices on a variety of different goods, and looked at what happens to consumption. It looks at what happens to some of the health consequences.
Well, and that's the question I want to ask, that what difference would taxes make anyway? I mean, if you use alcohol consumption, for instance, or you use smoking as an example, that there are taxes that have been imposed on that, but people who smoke continue to smoke anyway, or those who drink continue to drink anyway.
No, that's actually not the case. So we do see that when taxes go up, when prices go up, it's like any other consumer good. Basic laws of economics apply. So as price gets higher, people reduce their consumption of it. So with tobacco, I think we have the best evidence because many governments around the world have been taxing tobacco for a long time. And we see that when taxes go up, smokers try to quit smoking. We see smokers who continue to smoke cut back on how much they consume. And they're very effective at keeping kids from taking up smoking. So a lot of the work that I've done focuses on looking at how tax and price affect young people's decision to smoke, and we see that they're 3 times more responsive to price. And when I talk around the world about these issues, South Africa is actually one of my best examples of what can be done when a government gets serious about using tax as a way of trying to reduce smoking. So for a long time in South Africa, taxes had been going down. They weren't being adjusted for inflation. Prices, as a result, were going down after adjusting for inflation. And what you saw was smoking was going up. In the 1990s, the government decided it was going to do something about it, started by raising taxes, and as it raised tax, as it raised price, we immediately saw consumption come down. So the number of smokers has come down. And the same thing applies, the same evidence exists for alcohol, and it's starting to exist for sugary beverages.
But where would you start then with taxing sugary beverages as well as other products? Because it's not only the beverages, right? But would a good start be made if you started there?
Well, I think a good start is with sugary beverages because they're widely consumed. They account for a big part of sugar consumption in consumers' diets. And they have really no nutritional value. So it's the kind of thing where if you're going to pick some place to start, this is a good place to start.
Now, the beverage companies themselves would argue and say, you know, we've actually been doing our best to divert people from sugary-based beverages to the ones that we've added sweetness to, right? Or so-called light drinks that are without sugar.
Well, if you look at the data again, what you see is that sugar consumption, sugary beverage consumption has been going up over time. So whatever the companies are doing voluntarily isn't having much of an effect.
So what amount of tax would discourage people from consuming sugary-based products?
So this is an issue that we've been looking at. So in the US, we have states that tax different types of beverages, but the tax rates that we have are relatively low. So we're looking at taxes that's usually vary between 3 and 7% of price. And what we see is that those taxes in the end have very little effect. They don't raise price by enough to change consumption enough to really start to show up in terms of an impact on obesity, on diabetes. But what we do see is that when the tax is high enough, when you get at least a 20% increase in price, then you start to see big enough changes in consumption that really do translate into real health benefits.
And the companies are also arguing that there are going to be serious job losses as a result of the imposition of these taxes.
Well, the companies have argued this with tobacco taxes, they've argued it with the sugary beverage taxes, they've argued it with alcohol taxes. And again, the reality is very different. So I've been working on these issues around tobacco taxes for 30 years almost. The evidence there is very clear. When the taxes go up, you actually see net increases in employment. And we've been doing some work now with sugary beverage taxes where we see exactly the same thing. So when the tax goes into effect, price goes up, consumption goes down, and you do see some job losses in the beverage-specific jobs, the jobs that are really dependent on beverage production. But what ends up happening is that consumers that aren't spending money on sugary beverages now use that money and buy other goods and services, and that creates jobs in other sectors. And what we see is that the government gets new tax revenues, and they spend those revenues, and that typically goes into things that are very labor-intensive. So the work that we've done shows, if anything, you see a net increase in employment as a result of a tax like this, sugary beverage tax, tobacco tax, alcohol tax.
Now, I suppose for consumers, there's another point that needs to be raised, and I know you're an economist, but you can comment on this. It's about the addictive nature of sugar, that not many people realize or recognize that it is a drug, that sugar has the same effect as other addictive drugs, isn't it?
I was actually one of the first economists that studied the economics of addiction. So that was what I did in graduate school 30 years ago.
So there we go, right question for the
so
right
it's a good question.
Yeah.
And what we are starting to see is that sugar does have some addictive properties. And what that means for the tax is that the tax actually has a bigger effect over time. So because people are addicted, it takes longer to change their behavior. So you get some initial impact, but that effect grows over time as people continually change.
I'm asking the question because I'm imagining if you are taxing a sugary beverage, right, and you want to discourage me from consuming that, then I'll move to something else. I may have cake or ice cream or whatever, which may be tax-free.
Well, we've looked at those issues as well. So you do get some substitution in response. So you raise the price of the sugary beverages, and consumers do substitute to other sources of calories. But what you end up with is a net reduction in overall calories. And that's where, again, the size of the tax really matters. So a big enough tax is going to lead to a big enough reduction in calories where you won't have so much substitution that offsets that. And then you end up seeing the real benefits in terms of the improvements in weight and the reductions in the health consequences.
But is it not worth the while of those in authority and those who are making a case like yourself to say, okay, don't just tax the sugary beverages. Go after sweets, go after ice cream, go after chocolates, go after whatever has got sugar in it.
Well, there are some governments that have started to take a more comprehensive approach. And you see in Mexico, for example, they did a sugary beverage tax at the same time as they did a tax on junk food. We've seen countries like Hungary adopt a series of different taxes based on nutrient content, sugar and fats and some other things. But again, if you're going to start someplace, the easiest place to start, I think, is with sugary beverages, given how clear the link is between their consumption, obesity, diabetes, other consequences, given that it's a relatively easy tax to administer compared to a sugar tax that would be very broad-based. And given that, again, sugary beverages have no real nutritional value. So if you're going to start someplace, this is a good place to start.
Okay. Well, Prof, much appreciated. Thank you very much for
Thanks.
being our guest. We
Thanks for
appreciate
having
it.
me.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, do you agree with Professor Frank Chaloupka here or not? All right, I'd like to hear your views. You might have been on sugar all your life and you dread a future without sugar. So what do you think? Is taxing sugary drinks the way to go or not? We'd like to hear your views on Twitter @TimModise.